Hi, Mubdi. I can't hear back.
I was muted, sorry. I should know that by now. I really
It's
should know that
okay.
by now.
Welcome to CWSF STEM Talks. We will hear from 3 different speakers today, all who have attended CWSF as a finalist. Each talk will begin with a video followed by 10 to 15 minutes of live Q&A. Make sure to please put your questions into the FeedLoop Q&A section, and we will try to get to as many as possible. Let's begin. I'm happy to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Mubdi Rahman. Dr. Mubdi Rahman is a founder and principal of Sidrat Research. Mubdi is an astronomer with a deep background in research, computing, management, and outreach. Originally hailing from Toronto, Mubdi has served as a research associate at the Dunlop Institute for Astronomy and Astrophysics and an assistant research scientist at the Johns Hopkins University. Mubdi is known for taking a creative approach towards scientific and research problems, using techniques from a breadth of fields to find unique solutions. His curiosity has pushed his diverse research background, spanning star formation to cosmology. Outside his research, he has been a leading voice in STEM community outreach, having led initiatives at Youth Science Canada and Science Rendezvous. Mubdi holds a PhD in astronomy and astrophysics from the University of Toronto. Mubdi also serves as a scientific editor for the American Astronomical Society journals. Let's take a look.
Being an astronomer for me was always my dream. It was something that I wanted to do from the age of 2, really. And it was just something my parents thought I was a little crazy at that point. This is the age where kids are, wanting to be fire people or bankers or cooks or chefs or things, and I wanted to be an astronomer. And it sort of made my parents a little concerned. My parents both came to Canada back in the 1970s. Neither of them went to university. Neither of them had the ability to do science or even knew really what a life in science looked like. And so this was something that concerned them. And just my path to how do I get to be an astronomer, that was just never something that, random kid in, a poor part of northwestern Toronto ever really got to figure out. But the one thing I knew is I'd heard that science fairs existed, right? That was something that I'd seen and heard of. My schools weren't involved in them whatsoever, but I knew that they existed. I knew it was something that I could potentially do. And so my parents begrudgingly let me do this thing that was not, really related at all to my schoolwork. It wasn't going to get me better grades, but they realized that they had a uncontrollable kid who this was what he wanted to do. And so they sort of humored me in trying this. And I kind of had no real guidance. I didn't really know what I was doing. I had, taken a few books out of the public library that maybe talked a little bit about what a science fair project was, but it wasn't something that I had, no one around me did them. No one knew, what that would entail. And I remember being driven down to the University of Toronto and getting put next to, some incredible grade 7 kids and realizing just how outclassed I was. Don't get me wrong, I was super proud of my project. I had spent literally weeks in our school shop trying to make, some, very big apparatus to do the measurements for my project that year. And I didn't know what I was doing, and I was, trying to wing it as I go. But, I got there and put down, my entire, science fair board that was made out of, cardboard and construction paper. It was a little bit of a mess. And I was sitting next to kids that were like working with robotics kits and doing really, really cool things. And I realized that I wasn't like everyone else there. I didn't know what was going on. But this was potentially going to be a way for me to figure out how I might be able to do science. But every year I went back. In grade 8, I went back and learned a little more and, was happy with my project. And that was one that I was just happy I was able to get to the finish line and did this. And this was all at sort of the Toronto Regional Science Fair level. And then grade 9 was the first one when I was in high school that I even got an award and won anything at the fair. And so this was something that was building in me as something that I really wanted to do. And I was starting to be very passionate about, concerned my parents significantly that I was spending so much time doing this. So in grade 10, this was the year that I decided, I really want to go to the Canada Wide Science Fair. I'd heard about it, saw all people in the years prior to me being selected and getting a chance to go to what sounded like this awesome event. And I decided that was going to be my year. And so I wanted to do a project on something that I was passionate about and truly could spend a lot of time in something that I wanted to do. So I did a project on chaos theory in astronomy. And it sounds fancy, but I largely chose it because it seemed cool. It was the kind of work that I wanted to be able to do and the kind of science I wanted to get into, and certainly nothing that I was learning in my science classes in high school at that point. But I knew I wanted to do it. And so I, out of sheer luck, emailed various people, a lot of people, asking if I had a project in mind. I thought I knew a little bit about how I wanted to do it. And somebody eventually got back to me. A graduate student at the University of Toronto responded to me and was willing to be my mentor and help me through understanding what this project was and how I'd actually go about doing it. What I didn't realize at the time is that meeting her was going to change my life. Not only was I doing this project in astronomy, I was meeting somebody who was actually doing science for their life. And she just opened up an entire path for me. She taught me all about what there was in terms of being able to be a scientist. Every meeting that I had with her, it just opened my world up a little bit more. And I got to see, that there was a life doing science, that this passion that I had, this thing that I knew I wanted to do, there was a way, there's a path forward where I could actually make it happen. And I just, fell in love with the notion of being an astronomer, and because I now knew that there was a way that I could do this. So armed with that confidence and a project that I was finally proud of, I went down to the University of Toronto where the science fair was being held, and this was April of 2000, and I did my best to wow the judges. Much to my disappointment, I got a bronze medal. This was, mind you, the best I'd ever done in a science fair up until then. But I was just so disappointed, and I took it really hard. So I learned from that experience, and what I didn't realize is it was teaching me grit, something that ended up being super important throughout my science career, is the ability to, have the fortitude to be able to push forward when the universe doesn't hand you your way and things don't go perfectly and you get devastated. But that next year where, I worked even harder at that and learned the various things that I need to learn to be able to get to the next stage, I actually did finally get to make it for the first time ever, get to go to the Canada-wide Science Fair in grade 11. And so I made it to the Canada-wide Science Fair, and that was actually a year that I, to my own surprise, even won an award. I always was competitive. I always wanted to do better than I actually did. But looking back now, I don't even really remember who won what awards. That stuff just seems to not matter. I certainly remember how I did, but I just remember the experiences. I remember just so many people working and doing things related to science that they loved, and being thrown into groups of people who I had nothing in common with other than we had done science fair projects and had made it here. And this really gave me the confidence that, maybe I was actually good at this science thing. I could actually make this happen. So I came home and I was on a little bit of, a science fair high. I was excited, I was confident, and I thought next year, that was going to be my year, and I was going to apply for Team Canada, and I was going to hopefully do well, and it did not work that way. As, most stories go, they don't exactly turn out the way that you want, and that was the year that I was both got rejected from Team Canada, and I also did not get to go to the Canada-wide Science Fair again, and I was, heartbroken. I was devastated. I went from being very confident in my ability to do science to thinking, what was wrong with me? But all of these things slowly built just a little more grit and a little more resilience, and coming to them year after year just helped me sort of build that toughness that you need to try to make things work. Next year, the story ends up being a little happier. I took those moments and processed them, and I learned from them and put together a new project. I was starting to get to know the kind of fields and what within astronomy that I really was interested in, things that I would want to continue to do and understand and help, further what we as humans know about astronomy. And that was really about understanding how stars form, how stars are born, and how they live. And the graduate student, my mentor, who I was working with at that time, she was starting to get a little out of her element. So she introduced me to somebody who was a new professor at the University of Toronto, and we worked together on this fantastic project on understanding how stars could potentially form in these clouds of gas that are falling into our galaxy. And I was really excited about it, and I actually did make Team Canada this year. And again, these are things I was certainly happy with, being able to, represent my country, and being able to compete and talk about science at, the highest level for my age. But a lot of that stuff doesn't matter to me, with a couple decades between me and who I was back then, the things that I really remember is my dad, who, was always hesitant about me being an astronomer, of me wanting to pursue science, realizing that, his kid who got a second prize award in an international competition could actually maybe make this work. Looking back at it now, it would have been nicer if I'd been able to get to go to the Canada-wide Science Fair a little more, and I certainly have seen many people who've been able to make that happen. But I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad that it took me all of that learning, all of that, those times, all that frustration, because that, I think, made me a better scientist and gave me perseverance to be able to try to push forward. Leaving for university, I knew that's something that I needed to do. I was raised to always give more than you take, and I'd taken so much from my science fair career. I found ways of potentially following my dream, and I knew I had to give back. I knew I had to allow others to be able to try to find the way to follow theirs. And this was exciting to me. So the first year after I graduated, I started helping out behind the scenes at the Canada-wide Science Fair, getting on a plane, heading over to in that case, it was St. John's, Newfoundland. And that was the first of 15 Canada-wide Science Fairs, 15 times more Canada-wide Science Fairs than I ever did when I was doing projects I had the opportunity to help out in. When you do an undergraduate degree in science, you learn about science. You don't necessarily learn how to make science happen. And a lot of that is grit. It's about fortitude. It's about knowing how to deal with disappointment. It's about knowing how to build teams and make teams work. And I got the opportunity to do that. And a lot of the work that I put in to helping run the Canada-wide Science Fair, the many years after that helped me in my science as a whole. But on top of that, there were always connections throughout the rest of my career to science fair. When I did my PhD, my PhD supervisor was that professor back when who I met back in high school, and we were working on a star formation project together. That's what my thesis was about. We worked together. He's now a very good friend of mine, and through the process of doing that thesis, I got to make my first big discovery. I was trying to understand how stars form in our Milky Way galaxy. And through the process, completely by sheer luck, I was able to discover the biggest and most luminous of star clusters in our own galaxy. And I got to name it the Dragonfish Cluster. That's always a fun thing to do when you get to actually name something that's out there in space. One of the things I want to note is that this was not about me being smart. There's lots of smart people. Smart is common. Smart is everywhere. What's harder to get and what's important to get to great science is that fortitude, is that determination, is that realizing that the universe is going to tell you you're wrong a lot, that you will be very frustrated with it, but you'll persist on going because you want to know the answer and you want to figure out what the story there is. And that's a lot of what my science fair career taught me. Throughout my science career, I've gotten to go to places that, random kid from Rexdale never thought they'd be able to go. I got to do work on windswept Andean mountaintops in Chile, all the way to hanging out with kangaroos in Australia. I got to make discoveries. I got to make mistakes. I worked with people who had Nobel Prizes. I worked with people who had eras and theories of how the universe works named after them. And all of this was because of what I'd learned through the process of doing these science fair projects, and both the successes, but especially the disappointments, especially those hard times that I kept pushing through. There's a moment when you realize that you're living your dream, and it's not because everything's easy. It's not because everything is sorted out and you've gotten to the top level of something. It's when you realize that you've found your call. And I was lucky enough to know that. Science fairs, from my 7 years of doing projects as a student and my 15 years of helping out after the fact, it gave me a lot of experiences and opportunities. It's the reason I've been able to chase my dream. It's the reason I've been able to be an astronomer, and it's the reason I'm getting to find new dreams to chase.
Wow, that was such an incredible talk. We'll have some questions for you now, if you don't mind. So our first question comes from Jerome, and he was wondering, what do you hope to see, for the next 60 years that are to come of CWSF?
I mean, I hope to see things that I can't even imagine. I think that that's the most exciting part of being involved in anything related to science or understanding how the universe works is it is bigger than my mind, right? It is always going to be greater than anything I could even frankly imagine. People 60 years ago probably didn't, they had a very different view of the future. We've never been great at predicting, what the future is going to look like. And so I would love to see, grade 7 through 12 kids in the next 60 years, tackling the kinds of science that I can't even imagine, that the top level of science in universities wouldn't even, can't even touch right now. I think that would be what I'd be most excited about.
Yeah, that's such an incredible thought. Thank you. Our next question comes from Abigail. And they say, how did you stay motivated after missing those expectations that you had? You mentioned that, missing some of your goals at not making it to CWSF right away. How do you overcome that?
It's hard. I mean, anyone who tells you that it's not hard is not being straight up with you. It's difficult, right? Especially when you pour your heart and soul, but also like hours of time, you make sacrifices and things don't turn out your way. It sucks, right? Like there's no two ways about that. But I think the thing that always kept me going is recognizing that this is who I knew I was, right? Like this is the person I wanted to be. This is what I felt like I was meant to be doing. That it wasn't, this one, lack of expectations or missing this expectation. I wasn't going to let that stop me, right? That is just one step on a much longer story. And I just need to get over that step. And that's really what helped me keep going, is recognizing that, it wasn't, that how I did that year or exactly what had happened to me didn't define who I was.
And I think that's some really great advice for our finalists to take away too.
Yeah.
On that note, what was your number one takeaway from being a finalist at CWSF? What was the one thing, I guess, that resonated with you?
I think one of the big things for me was just realizing how diverse and big everything that we call science and technology really is, right? Like we have oftentimes, we'll learn in science classes or through our own research or, through what we see in documentaries or various sources, science media, a very specific view of how science happens, how it goes about. We're even taught in many cases a very predictable view of hypothesis, methods, all that kind of stuff. Science doesn't work like that. Science goes in every single direction, every single way, and people will do science in some of the craziest ways and still come to a better understanding of how the universe works, or being able to use how the universe works to better humanity and better life here. And that's all valid and that's all great. And that's one of the things that I got from, being at science fairs and especially being at the Canada-wide Science Fair, is that science is bigger than what I thought it was.
Amazing. Now here we are at day 4 of CWSF, and we are going to be wrapping up soon. So on that note, what do you think finalists can do, when they get home, when they finish this week, to kind of keep their momentum going and keep building off of the takeaways they've had from this week?
I think one of the big things that worked for me, at least, and it may work for many of the finalists that are out there, especially for those of you who are coming to the Canada-wide Science Fair for the first time, remember all the steps that took to get you here, right? Like what's going to happen in a few hours at the award ceremony, that's just one moment. Everything that you did to get you to the place where you were chosen and selected based on the work and the effort and the science and the talent that you put in to get to a national level, all of that matters. That's an achievement, right? The accolades are, independent. The awards, that's independent. You have made an achievement, and that's the thing that's worth taking home, because you'll be able to do that again. Right, you'll be able to achieve, even if there isn't an accolade, or even if there's a massive accolade, the achievement will always be with you.
Amazing. Now kind of talking a little bit more about the ambassadors on behalf of myself and the fellow ambassadors. Why do you think the ambassador program is so important to CWSF? And also, what kind of motivated you to continue coming back to CWSF as a volunteer or as an ambassador?
Yes. So we started the ambassador program back actually in 2011, about, 11 years ago was actually the 50th anniversary of the Canada Science Fair. And one of the things that the reason why the ambassador program initially was created, and the idea behind it was, we've got this incredible community of people who've gone through science fair and are now doing fantastic, incredible things outside of it in diverse fields, not necessarily even directly related to science. In some cases, everything from law to to politics to art, all over the place. And so this, the ambassadors and that entire program, and bring people back to the fair, was a great way of being able to create the kind of role models that I didn't get to see myself, right? People who had gone through the process, and just opening people's eyes up to the diversity of what you could do. And importantly for the ambassadors and the people who come back and volunteers, such as yourself, I think, one of the most important parts is recognizing that you got to be a part of such a great community. You've gotten so much out of it that this is your way of being able to pass it forward and to the next generation.
Absolutely. I think you said it exactly right. Everybody just wants to pay it forward, and everyone is so grateful for their past experiences here at CW. My next question comes from Rakshit. So what exactly are you studying right now in astronomy? And then did that love for the field you're in now come from your science fair projects, or did you develop that kind of later on in your career?
So what I'm doing now is actually, there's quite a variety of little things. One of the things that's great about once you get to a more senior part in your science career is that you actually start tipping your toes into a bunch of different pools and a bunch of different kinds of science. So one of the areas that I'm actually working on right now is I'm involved in a big project that's across North America, involving universities, both here in Canada and the US and a couple other places, where we're actually setting up a bunch of telescopes all across North America, thousands of kilometers, in some cases in some remote wilderness, to be able to identify what we call fast radio bursts. They're basically these big bursts of light, radio light specifically, that are we know that they're coming from beyond our galaxy. We know that they could potentially be some of the brightest and most luminous things in the universe. And that's about all we know about them, right? Again, it's kind of embarrassing when you think of it, something that could be the brightest thing, and all you know is that it exists, right? You don't know much more about that. And that's the problem that we're trying to solve right now. And I'm, continuing work on trying to understand how galaxies form stars and how that happened from the Big Bang till now. That's another area that I'm, keenly interested in, both from an observational perspective, going to telescopes and using data that comes from telescopes, all the way to actually simulating what the universe looks like, and understanding how that simulation, plays out, and it helps us understand the physics of what's going on in the universe. But a lot of this also just, part of it stemmed from, I always had that love for astronomy. This is something that I thought I wanted to be able to tell some of the grandest stories in the universe, and what grander stories in the universe are there than the universe itself. But then through doing science fairs, I got to expose myself to different areas, realizing it's a big field, and you got to choose and you got to find the places that you think are the most interesting, and the ones that really speak to you. And that's it was kind of a little bit of a feedback loop there.
Wow, very cool. That sounds like some incredibly in-depth and very interesting research that you're doing. And I think we have time for one more question today. So you've had a ton of different STEM experiences throughout your life. What is your favorite thing that you've done in the past, and what is your favorite thing you're doing now?
That is a highly difficult question. I've been very lucky. I mean, I think one of my favorite things to do that has happened to me in the past. I mean, there is very little as exciting, especially as a kid growing up and having seen the space shuttles and all of that, to be invited to NASA to talk about the work that you've done. Right, that is an exciting moment when you get to go to the same place that astronauts went to be trained to go to the moon and talk about the work that you came out with and that you worked on. That's always exciting, right? And so that's definitely up there as one of my top my top STEM moments or science moments. And one of the most exciting things that I'm actually working on right now is part of what I'm doing right now is trying to figure out ways of doing science better. And so using techniques from fields, like astronomy and other fields like computer science or statistics or potentially even medicine, to help us all do research better and get to your next discovery better, and trying to figure out what that would look like. Oftentimes in science, we go into we're very tunnel visioned about a specific aspect, but little do we know that we can learn a lot from the field right over. And so I'm trying to help do that, and that's always been very exciting to me right now.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom and experiences with us today at CWSF.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you, Mabdi. We'll move over now to our next speaker for the day. So our next speaker is Stephanie Gaglione. Stephanie is a PhD candidate in chemical engineering at MIT. She uses viruses to unlock the secret of how immune cells see and to explain why some people are immune to pathogens that cause severe disease. She graduated from the University of Oxford with an MSc in immunology and MSc in molecular cell biology in 2019, and from the University of Toronto with a Bachelor of Arts in Science in chemical engineering in 2017. She is an alumna of CWSF 2008, 2009, and 2010 from York and Toronto. Let's check it out.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Gaglione, a PhD candidate in chemical engineering at MIT. Today, I'm going to share some of my career and science fair journey with you. I first encountered the idea of a science fair in 2008 when I was in 8th grade and saw a brochure on my teacher's desk. I thought the activity seemed unusual. I'd never heard of a science fair. But upon looking into it, I thought I might find a community that I fit into and was curious about the idea of exploring science beyond a textbook. So I found an article on bioremediation on a computer encyclopedia and started delving into textbooks to see if I could find an interesting question to answer. I had not anticipated anything coming from it, gone to the regional fair and had a great time presenting everything I'd worked on, including Home Depot trips to buy soil and oil and fertilizer. But to my surprise, I was nominated to go to the CWSF. When I arrived at CWSF, I was surprised to find a community of people who were just like me. People who wanted to answer tough questions, who wanted to work on things, whether they worked or didn't, but who were curious about the scientific process. And from there, I'd met such good friends. I'd had such a fantastic experience and I was hooked. I returned in 2009 and 2010 with different projects on bioremediation and green roofs, never feeling that the science I was doing was earth-shattering in any way, but thinking that this was the beginning of a journey into what science really was. And it departed from what I had thought about in the class, and it let me apply knowledge that I was acquiring through textbooks and through teachers and through learning into real projects. So here I have pictured my first science fair project in green roofs, where I put green roofs in my basement and tried to grow plants on them. In retrospect, not a great idea to grow plants on green roofs in your basement, as opposed to doing it in the spring or summer where it would be logical. But it was a determination to see what I could make work in the most ridiculous environments. From 2011 onward, I decided to up my game in science. And decided to participate in the Sanofi BioGenius Challenge. Sanofi BioGenius Challenge allowed me to work with a mentor in the 12th grade at a local hospital in downtown Toronto. And this is where I gained the first exposure to graduate students and to the entire idea of academic research. Coming from a family that didn't have any academic connection or and not having any prior understanding of what academic research was. The science fair community is what really exposed me to that. I remember seeing senior students as an 8th, 9th, 10th grader who had completed projects that were so far beyond what I thought a teenager would be capable of. And so I started to look into what academia really meant. And that's when I came across some graduate students in the Sanofi BioGenius Challenge, and where I completed my first baby steps into the thinking that goes into more advanced projects. From there, I joined the University of Toronto, and the experience of the science fair really led me to thinking that engineering might be the right path for me. I loved tinkering, I loved thinking through complex problems and trying to come up with solutions to them. The science fairs gave me the initial steps toward that, especially this work in designing a green roof. But I didn't feel that, of course, at that point that I'd had any real experience or sense of how this could shape into a career. So that's where the University of Toronto came in. I chose a general first-year engineering program with the uncertainty of what the right path would be. And within that, I completed an internship after my first year. This internship actually came out of my experience in the Sanofi BioGenius Challenge. As a first-year undergrad, it can be very difficult to find the right internship. And I knew that I wanted to do something in science and engineering, but it's hard when you don't have any prior experience, and where really my only experience was in science fairs, tinkering around and trying to learn how to ask good questions and answer them. So it was to my surprise when, after having considered research for the summer, or considered applying to work in the oil industry as a potential future chemical engineer, I received a letter in the mail from Sanofi saying that due to my participation the previous year in this challenge and an award I'd won there, that I was eligible to interview for an internship. Again, as a high school student, I was never thinking about internships. So it was to my surprise a year later when that science fair experience had yielded the first real industry experience that I was going to participate in. So I joined Sanofi Pasteur for the summer, and that experience inevitably shaped my journey into chemical engineering. I had decided to join chemical engineering for my second year, just before the internship, and my experience at Sanofi solidified that. The following summer, I delved into business, trying to move beyond my field. And this is something that, if I look back, science fairs prepared me to do, to start with something you're completely unfamiliar with, and do your best to acquire some knowledge and skills, and to push beyond what you're comfortable with, because that's what good science does. It pushes beyond what pushes beyond what we already know. So for me, on a personal level, that culminated in a sampling business at Procter & Gamble. And I worked for a summer there in the division that examined products at Walmart. I gained some fantastic new experiences. But despite that, some part of me just couldn't let go of science and couldn't let go of engineering. At this point, I really didn't think research would be the right fit. Having experienced industry and having experienced, the more industry-focused engineering professions from my experience in chemie, I had thought that I would be interested in that type of career. But after my experience at Procter & Gamble, I knew I wanted to move backward into bioresearch, or something biological once again. And so from there, I took a gap year after my third year. And this is where, once again, I hate to tie it back to science fairs, but I'm talking to you all. So I'm trying to get you to think of what this experience will mean to you. I felt comfortable cold emailing and cold messaging, meaning sending messages and emails to people who I had not met before. And I think that came from the experience of having initiated that in high school, where I learned to meet with graduate students, or meet with undergraduate students who were doing work in areas I was interested in as it related to the science fair project I was doing. Similarly, after my third year, in my early 20s, it was much easier to jump out of that comfort zone and send some cold emails to people in places that I desperately wanted to learn from. And so after my experience at Sanofi, I had thought that Sanofi is a major vaccine manufacturer, and I was quite fascinated with the ideas of chemical engineering as they applied to manufacturing vaccines and understanding drug delivery. And so I sent some cold emails on LinkedIn to a consultant who worked at the World Health Organization, and after much demonstrating that I would be willing to work hard and apply my skills to a specific project they had in mind, and receiving some funding, I spent the summer in Switzerland, in Geneva, learning about public health policy. And I had decided at the beginning of the gap year that I would use that full year to learn everything I could about the different career options available to someone who's interested in vaccines and interested in a career in a realm in biology. So I had also sent a cold email to a professor here at MIT. And the professor is actually Robert Langer, who's a major professor behind Moderna and behind a lot of the major industry here in Boston in the biotechnology sector. And to my surprise, it was sent to some postdocs who are people who've already completed PhDs and work in labs, sent to a postdoc who was happy to have a full-time research technician for a year. So I spent about a year down here in Boston working full-time in a research lab. And this was a departure from what I had traditionally seen at the University of Toronto in engineering. I was surrounded by graduate students and other undergrads and postdocs who were in the business of academia, cared very deeply about building technology that would translate into industry, would translate to patient bedside. And that was unconventional from where I had spent most of my time, which was in a more industry-focused environment where my peers all wanted to become process engineers or work in business. And I loved it. So having come from, the early tinkering and science fair world in my basement to the industry side where I explored what it means to have a product in the real world, to selling that product, and then back to the early stage, but at a level where I could really start to understand how to do science in a rigorous, practical way. I had sort of come full circle in my way of thinking. But this is the moment when I truly decided that I would want to pursue a career in research and want to spend the next many years of my life in this profession. So when I returned to school, I had also received a cold email in my inbox while I was here at MIT as a visiting undergraduate student working as a research technician that was intended for senior postdocs in the lab. And it was from NASA looking for a few postdocs who would be interested in working on manufacturing biomaterials for missions to Mars. And I thought, this is the most fascinating, insane email I have ever received in my life. And so I saved the email. And when I went back to school, I knew that I had to do something called a capstone. And in your final year of engineering, it's very common to do these complete projects that culminate the entirety of your undergraduate degree and that combine skills from all of your years. And I had the opportunity to build a team and to select our own project and to select our own advisor. And so I thought, well, I have this great email and I would absolutely love to work with NASA. Wouldn't that be the most amazing culmination of this experience? I had a little bit of a side interest in space, but because I'd gone so far down the track of biotech, it hadn't seemed viable for a career option for me. And I wasn't as didn't see the path there moving forward. But I thought that I would love to dabble in it and maybe touching back to my science fairs, this felt like the culminating science fair project for me of my entire undergrad. So I put a team together of some of my my best friends and classmates in chemical and mechanical engineering, and sent a cold email to the director who had emailed the lab that while I was there. And he seemed quite happy to have six undergraduate students in their final year working with a professor full-time to do some background research and try to design some bioreactors. And so we spent the year doing that. Went down to visit the facilities, put together a research report, built some models. We all had the understanding that this wasn't going to be the be all and end all. But I think that's what makes people good scientists, when you realize that there's always a next step, and that, especially for the first 10 years of this journey, you really are on an exponential phase of growth. And so, this represented, the opportunity to learn how to read and understand literature and research in a field that was so far beyond what I had already known. And that was a fantastic experience, but it was also a time that I used to decide what graduate school program I'd want to join. And I'd said, I'd had an interest in space, but this experience did lend me to think, okay, this was fantastic, but this is not what I want to focus my career on. And in the end, it was the work I did in vaccines. And at that time, I had been studying, in my time in Boston, I had been studying how to deliver drugs best to a type of immune cell. I thought, well, immunology seems fascinating, and understanding how we can design new tools and technologies to improve clinical outcomes in immunology would be a fascinating way to start a career. And so I had applied to graduate programs, PhD programs, and also applied to a scholarship to be in the UK for 2 years in order to bolster my skill set. And as you develop as a researcher, you learn how important it is to build foundational knowledge, to take the time to learn the basics before you start to address the more advanced things. And my science fair experience, I felt that I had, as a high school student, I hadn't realized that I've always wanted to do things that were flashy and sounded great, but that to really build a career in something, to really have an impact, you have to take your time. You have to take the years to learn the foundational skills, whether that's, in my case, an undergrad in chemical engineering, and then to build the biology knowledge that would allow me to do work in that field. I feel sometimes I say that you can't play the game unless you know the rules, and it's very important to take the time to learn those rules. So I took 2 years and did 2 masters in immunology and molecular cell biology, and that's where I spent deep time and long hours thinking and learning about how immune cells work, specifically a type of cell we call a T cell, which many of you have heard of now, and especially in light of the pandemic. So at the end of my 2 years in the UK, I came back this time as a PhD student and applied to chemical engineering and biological engineering, chose chemical engineering in order to preserve my numerical background and approach problems from a chemical engineering perspective. And I now work on designing new tools to probe how immune cells respond to viruses. And I get to do this, using my best engineering skills, deep problem solving, learning to ask good questions, designing a tool and then tweaking that tool over several years in order to unlock new secrets that we've never known about. In my case, how people are immune to HIV. There are a couple of people who have the ability to develop good immune responses, very, very few. And understanding that has been exceptionally difficult with tools that we currently have as researchers and doctors. And so understanding that might unlock new therapeutics for people who live with HIV or other chronic viruses. So that's how I'm currently spending most of my time. And I look back and think about how I started where all of you were, tinkering in my basement, trying to understand what this scientific process is. And I look back, over a decade later, and I'm still learning and still growing and reflecting on how the toughest thing to do even now is to ask good questions and to systematically and methodically answer them. And that's what drew me to science and drew me to research as a way of conducting science. As early on, I felt it was very difficult to ask good questions, and I still am working on that ability. But I hope that as you embark upon your journey to become a scientist, to become a researcher, or not to join industry in a non-science capacity, whatever it is, that you treasure this time where you first started to think about how you can ask questions about things that no one has ever been able to know or answer, and to take the time and exercise the brain power to come up with an answer, and to do so in a way that inspires confidence and inspires a next step toward unlocking what the final frontier of human knowledge is. And so I hope you've all had a fantastic time at CWSF. And best of luck on your science and career journeys.
Wow, thank you, Stephanie, for sharing your really incredible journey with us today. We have some questions for you from the chat. So our first one is, why do you think students or people in general tend to gravitate towards science fair while exploring STEM? Do you think that this is the best way to start exploring STEM in your youth?
That's a good question. I would say the best way to explore STEM is the first way that you encounter. So, as a very young person, I was sometimes wandering through the forest, learning about the flora and fauna and biodiversity, not knowing about science fair. That's a fine way to explore it. For me, it was science fairs, and I think for many of you it is. And what is so particularly special about that experience is you get to select the area of your interest. You get to select the thing you're passionate about, and it provides a structure for you to build on it, to, achieve a final goal, some, deliverable, a document, a poster, and then you get to share it with others. It's very rare in life that you get to choose that type of scientific passion and then put it together into some form and have people to share it with, your peers, your family, your friends, teachers. It really is a great way to gain that early exposure to STEM that I don't think many other programs do. But that's not to say that there aren't other ways of doing it. I think it's particularly special in Canada that we have the Canada-wide Science Fair and that it is promoted so broadly in our schools. I'd love to see more students have the chance to create these types of independent projects, and especially being south of the border, I look to see what American students experience, and it's not quite the same. So I think it's phenomenal that everyone has the chance to think and participate in this now, and I hope that we can. And you all too can speak to friends and family and encourage them to participate.
That's incredible. And I think you said it exactly right. Building that network of people who get excited about science with you. Going further off of that note, do you have any tips to help us with networking or on how to build a good network for things you're interested in?
Yeah, great question. And something I encourage quite a few of you to start thinking about, especially as you move through high school and your undergraduate years. My best recommendation is to, make a list of people you find inspiring, talks you go to and hear. When you're reading a magazine article, if a name jumps out at you as someone interesting in a field of science. Professors have their emails publicly online, graduate students. Someone once told me that as a student, anyone will talk to you. People will give you the time when you're a student, and that's not something you might have forever. So the worst someone can say is no. So my best recommendation, make a list of people you find interesting. If you can find their emails, and in academia, that's very common as you approach an undergrad, and then to send an email. And if you don't get a response, not to take it personally, usually people have hundreds of emails coming in their inbox to send a follow-up after a week. And when you decide to meet with someone and to ask questions, to be thoughtful, to be humble, to acknowledge that time, and to take the most out of it. Ask if they can connect you with others who might share another particular interest you have. But to take that time to write down what you find interesting and to follow the paths of others before you. I always found others' journeys very inspiring, so I thought it was helpful to share my own.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely loved hearing about your journey, and I'm sure everyone else did as well. And I think that's really good advice for helping us to learn to build networks and to reach out and have that confidence to, cold email. Our next question comes from Daniel, and he says, I liked hearing about your experience in learning a new field. What advice do you have for someone who wants to try something new or really get out of their field?
Oh, great question. And one of the hardest things, to be honest, I think the most successful people I've met, and maybe the reason I modeled how I'm trying to learn off it, the most successful people are people who are don't put themselves in a place to be the smartest in the room, but instead put themselves in a place where they have the most to learn. So, when I joined the UK and sat in this classroom at Oxford in immunology, I thought I knew a little bit and I had a little bit of research experience. But within about 5 minutes, I quickly realized that I knew not much. and I spent the next 6 months, so immersed in it, deciding that, that my fear comes from being incompetent and that's what drives me. It's a bit of a dark thing, but I feel that that's sometimes what pushes me forward. And so I spent a lot of time learning, but because I was in an environment where I knew, a lot less, I had a lot more to gain from that experience, I think, than coming in, already knowing things. So a few things to say. One, if you don't know much about a topic, not to take that as a sign of I'm never going to be competent in this field, but instead to say, okay, this means that I have the most to gain on a topic and to put the effort into learning it. Nobody starts any field knowing everything or even anything. The people who seem like experts were people who were in the same spot as you, probably not as long ago as you think. So I know I'm a little long-winded in this answer, but that it is, one, worth doing, and two, being patient with yourself, taking as much time as it takes, being committed to it, like any if some of you are athletes out there, like any training plan, it takes a lot of time to get to the point where you feel that competency, and to let yourself go through that journey before discounting yourself.
That's excellent advice. Thank you. And noting some of those experiences, that kind of took you out of your field, you traveled a lot, which is really incredible. How does traveling and spending time kind of outside of your hometown, how did you find that it benefited your STEM experience overall?
Yeah, good question. Every city, country, and university seems to do science a bit differently. And I think that has greatly enriched how I approach research, even as a PhD student, and how I'm thinking about how to do science going forward. So, as an example, the way we address questions here at MIT tend to be very tool-based. The solution to problems is to design a new tool. Whereas the UK, we spent, and here in the US, there's a great emphasis upon, try it. If you don't know what the answer is, give it a shot. Whereas in the UK, we would sit around whiteboards a lot more and to deliberate and debate what the right approach to a question was, and spend a lot of time thinking about fundamental biology. And we would spend weeks designing an experiment before executing it. So just a different philosophy on how research is done. So now I feel I'm trying to blend the best of both and to use that in my own research. So as an example, if I'm trying to build a tool and I try to jump straight to a conclusion, sometimes doing an hour of research on basic biology can save me weeks of experimental time. So needless to say, spending time in different environments, whether it's international or not, I think there's huge diversity even between fields. You spend time in a basic immunology lab or an engineering lab, you'll find drastic differences in how, and how questions are approached and how tools are designed. And so that type of enrichment really helps.
That's really amazing. And you're becoming, a scientist that has learned so many of these techniques, and combining them together is just incredible. I'm kind of switching gears a little bit here. There's a question asking about any recommendations you have for applying for research-oriented scholarships or grants, particularly when you're looking at higher education, so your master's, your PhD funding, things like that. Do you have any advice?
Yeah, great question, and a tough one. First thing I'll say is that lots of failure, and this also ties back to your early question on learning and being in a new field. I know someone asked that to the previous speaker, but learning to deal with failure, I think, is really important and something I'm still working on. And so when you apply to scholarships and fellowships, you will get rejections. And being able to mourn those and say, okay, this is upsetting and I'm going to spend the time being upset, I find that really helps me, and not, criticizing myself for being disappointed, and that's okay. But beyond that, where do you apply? What do you do? So for post-secondary education, for post-grad education, most PhDs, and in fact, I would say, I don't want to say all, but usually all PhDs in Canada and the US are funded. And that would be by your research advisor, or by a university to some degree. It can differ in other countries, but that does take a load off, something I hadn't known. The other thing is, scholarships and fellowships that there are there. And so meeting with senior students who have recommendations on what you can apply for. There is a complication to being a Canadian in the US where, I'm not eligible for American scholarships and fellowships. And so something for you to think about, the Canadian government has quite a few fellowships for Canadians who, are either doing PhDs in Canada or the US. So in my own case, I put together an application to the Canadian Institute of Health Research. So recommendations: one, speak to senior students. They always have lists of scholarships they've applied to and can help you apply for. You can reach out to alumni, again, similar to the cold messaging I mentioned earlier. And three, I had no clue when I was a high school student that PhDs were funded. So that's something that you can think about as you move through. It's a unique feature of the academic career.
You made some really excellent points for all of us to consider. Thank you. Our next question comes from Taylor. And she says, if you were to go back to the beginning, the very beginning of your science career, what would you do differently?
Oh, that's a tough one. Let me think for a second. I want to say that I would have diversified a little bit further in what I studied. I think I tried to choose things that I thought I would be good at, so to speak. But I don't think that's as important. And the most second thing, and probably the bigger thing, is I think I saw senior students doing these insane flashy projects, and I was so impressed by it and mesmerized. But I always thought that whatever I was doing just wasn't good enough or wasn't important if it, didn't have a complicated title. And that's something I took to heart a bit. And looking back, I think I would not have as much of that self-criticism, and I would look and think, you know what, that's not the point of this. The point of this is to learn what the scientific process is. And I think that that's something you should all take with you. And regardless of how an awards ceremony goes, and, I was not someone who won awards. I wasn't winning the gold medal at CWSF. And that was, fine in retrospect, because that's not why I was there. But it can feel like that in the moment. So don't make it so much about the competition if you find yourself going there, and remember that the reason you're here is to learn. And in doing so, this is the time to take risks. If you want to do some science fair project out in the, on a topic you know nothing about, just do it. So that's my recommendation.
I think that's some really great advice, especially in the light of our award ceremony tonight. I think that finishes up our question period for today. So thank you so much, Stephanie, for all of your wisdom and for your presentation today.
Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. It's an honor, and I wish you all the best of luck.
You as well. Thank you. Our final speaker today will be Nika Elmi. A former CWSF ambassador, alumnus, and judge, Nika Elmi is a population health researcher committed to social justice through education, research, and advocacy. As a researcher in the Center for Public Health and Human Rights at Johns Hopkins University, Nika used epidemiology to explore barriers to care for marginalized and often excluded populations, including sexual minorities, incarcerated populations, and individuals experiencing homelessness. She practiced these skills at the World Health Organization, where she analyzed barriers to postnatal care for migrant mothers, and at the International Rescue Committee, where she contributes to health programming in response to humanitarian crises. In her community, Nika volunteers as a sexual assault crisis line responder and is a former HIV counselor at detention centers and methadone maintenance clinics. Nika believes in the need to reduce barriers to STEM programming for youth and hopes to apply her practices in public health to build a more resilient and prosperous STEM system for all. Let's hear it from Nika.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Nika, and I'm a CWSF alumni and a former ambassador. And in the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to chat a little bit about my journey, how I got here, and some of the lessons that I learned along the way. So a little bit of an intro. I did science fair back in 2015, and I was with the York delegation, and we went to Fredericton. And then following this, I went to university. I'll get into the specific timeline in the next slide. And then after that, I pursued a Master's of Science in Public Health at Johns Hopkins, where I focused on themes like health equity and the specific projects too I'll chat about later. But right now, some of my work experiences include working with the World Health Organization and the International Rescue Committee. And that's a massive NGO that does research in conflict and post-conflict settings. So the timeline itself, I graduated from Queen's in 2019, and when I was there, I studied life sciences and art history. And then following this, I went to Hopkins in Baltimore and then did my master's. And then after this, what I'm doing right now and will graduate from in 2024 is medical school at McMaster University. So I'm happy to be back in Canada. So this is what I like to call the timeline that you don't usually see. So in 2013, I mentioned I did science fair in 2015. In 2013 is when I have a very vivid memory of first learning about what science fair even was. I remember overhearing it. It wasn't even from people that I knew. I just remember overhearing it and then really quickly being intimidated and flooded by thoughts of like, oh, you know, you have to be a specific kind of student to be able to do it, or you have to be super smart, or science fair just seemed really, really out of reach. And that was kind of debilitating for that year or so, because it just felt like really wanting something and then feeling like that wasn't for you. So that was a little bit tricky, but the following year is when I started reaching out to different profs, different labs, and I found a project. I found someone that was willing to mentor me. I think I sent out 20 or 30 emails and only one person responded, being super willing to mentor me and have me on board, especially because I was quite young at that age, and it was Dr. Anna Andriatsa and Dr. Helena Kim at U of T. And then I did my first science fair, and I didn't get anything. Nothing really came from it. So I was really discouraged because my goal, I think, was incorrectly, oh, you know, you have to win. You're doing this to get something from it. And that's something I hadn't really clarified, that that's something could be much more than just, you know, going on stage for an award. So I did my first science fair, and then I did a few other science fair in the process. And, you know, in all of them, I went home empty-handed. And then finally, when I was in grade 12, in my last year, I was able to go to the CWSF, and I was with the York delegation. We were a small group. We were a group of 4, and we went to Fredericton. So it ended up being really nice because I got to have the experience that you're all going to have now and in this week. So here's a little collage, I suppose, of the journey. So when I was at Science Fair, I received one of the senior awards, so it was just for grade 12 students, and I was able to go to the Weizmann Institute and research there for a month, so that was pretty cool. And then some of the other photos here are my experiences as an ambassador, you know, welcoming the students in at the airport, meeting some amazing people, some of my best friends now. And yeah, so that's another opportunity that I'll go into next. So 2 really important pieces, and I think are the main message that I want to get across, is that with science fair, it's the skills that you're really hoping to get and that you will get. You know, if you're here now, you've already gotten some of these skills. So while winning is, you know, something that a lot of us want and we think is the goal, when I reflect on my experiences and I reflect on where I am now, being a few years out of science fair now, I really believe that the things that shaped me most and the things that granted me the most opportunities in life weren't the award or getting to put that on my CV. It was all the things that I had to do to get to science fair, to learn about the scientific method, to learn how to create a poster. You know, if academia or research is something you want to get into, knowing how to communicate your findings is a really, really important skill to have. Knowing how to present to different judges, to present to the public, to different audiences. Those are all incredibly, incredibly helpful skills. And I think going even further back, you know, at the beginning of building up the courage and the confidence to even enter the world of research, you know, I had no idea what I was going to do. I didn't know how I was going to get there. I didn't have people around me that I could ask. You know, there was no one around me that had done science fair. Overcoming that and then finding the people, you know, not being afraid to ask for help, not being afraid to ask for mentorship from complete strangers that end up being, you know, really meaningful people to you, is also just, it's such a strength if you're able to do that, and if you have done that to get here now. So I think finding those skills and maybe even reflecting yourself as you're watching this of wow, you know, what are all the things that I had to do to get here now, and how can I keep practicing those skills? I think that thought process and that reflection is going to be what gets you, you know, the furthest really in your research and school and your personal projects, whatever it is that you're passionate about. So that's the first piece. And then the second piece, and I'll get to this in the next slide with my lessons learned, is you don't have to have it all figured out right now. That was something that I really grappled with when I was in science fair, especially because I was getting grade 12. I, you know, considered myself an older student. You know, I'm still in school, and I'm probably going to be in school for the next 10 years of my life. So it's funny, it's comical thinking about that now. But in that moment, you know, I think I put so much pressure on myself of, I need to have it all figured out right now. Like this project, the project that I do, and I did one on bipolar disorder, that has to be the thing that I pursue in university, following that, and, you know, whatever I want to do in my, you know, adult life. But that's really not the case. Like, I think one of my biggest pieces of advice would be to think about what excites you today. What do you really care about? What do you love hearing about, love reading about, researching about? And then explore that. And if that changes, which hopefully it will, because you learn more every time you explore a new theme or a new topic, then that's great. And, you know, if you have found your passion right from the get-go and you're like, okay, this is what I want to do the rest of my life, that's also amazing. But I hope that in that pursuit, you still try to explore different things or try to look at that idea from different perspectives. So big piece of advice is you don't have to have it all figured out right from the very beginning. Your story really is building, which with each of your decisions, with each of the things and topics that you try to pursue and want to explore. So I mentioned the ambassador program. This is a really great way to get involved with science fair once you're out of high school. I hope you remember your ambassadors, so the people in the purple shirts. You know, whether you were virtual or you had the in-person experience, ambassadors are a really important piece of science fair because they're kind of like your automatic friend as soon as you start science fair, and they're the person that's going to support you. As an ambassador, you are given a group of students to mentor and support, and it's just overall a really great experience. So if you are approaching the end of science fair, I really encourage you to look into the ambassador program and see if that's something that you would want to do to stay involved and to give back to the community. So this slide is where to next. I just want to quickly go back to my point about not having it all figured out right from the beginning. So the work that I did was in a wet lab. I did pharmacology and psychiatric work. And so that's all I really knew. But when I went to grad school, I saw, wow, there's so much more. Like, you can do qualitative work if you really care about stories and people, or you can do quantitative if you like quantitative truths and love stats and analyzing data. And then there's also programmatic work. So you can work for an NGO or a company or whatever group and do monitoring or an evaluation or find an intervention and try to figure out how useful or helpful it was. So there's really different ways to approach research. And so just to really drive that point home, here are a few of the themes, a few of the different papers and projects that I've worked on. You can see it spans a wide range of themes. And it's really about the skills that you gain in each of these projects that you take to your next project that is what's going to help you the most. So be curious. You don't have to stick to one thing. Pursue the topic that you really care about and then explore that. Ask questions. If you want something, ask for it. If you take away anything from this presentation, let it be this. Most of my opportunities came from finding people directly at a conference, or, I read an article and reached out to the author and asking them about opportunities. And that's how doors open for me. A lot of the times things aren't broadcasted publicly, and you really have to ask to be looped into other people's networks. And then finally, trust yourself. In my story, there were so many things that weren't necessarily easy or that I had to do multiple times to get to where I wanted to be. But once I got there, it was so worth it. And each time as cheesy as it sounds, I really did refine my skills, and I got stronger and I gained the confidence. And then when I got there, I really felt like I deserved it because I worked so hard to get there. So you're all here now at Science Fair, and I really hope you feel like you deserve to be here, because you absolutely do. So that's my story so far. I left this question of what will yours be? Because you're building it now, and as the days goes on, you're adding a different sentence and a different chapter to that story. So feel free to find me on socials, on LinkedIn. Feel free to send me an email if you have any questions, and I'll see you all at the Q&A. Thanks for watching.
That really was an amazing talk. Thank you so much, Nika.
Thanks.
So we do have some questions for you today. First one comes from Prabnur. So she says, often I have a question and think it's a great area to do an experiment in, but then I do some research and realize that there's already lots that's known about it. What is your advice for finding an area to research in the world that will benefit the world?
Yeah, that is such a good question. And it's so hard. Like I remember when I was younger, I would sit at my computer and I was just like, come on, like think of something, what is going to have an impact? And that was really hard because it's hard to narrow down what you care about and what hasn't been done. One thing I will say is whenever you read papers, they're usually framed in a way where it's very novel and they've discovered something that's really important. But usually at the end of those papers, there's a space where it says how it can grow or what gaps are still not addressed by that paper. So while at a glance, it might seem like it's been all figured out, most of the time it hasn't. And that's the really cool thing about just STEM and STEAM in general is that there's so many opportunities to explore and find different topics. So what I'd actually do is if you know something, you're lucky enough to know what you care about, do a quick what's called a quick lit review. So quickly scan through the literature, see what exists, and then in that find what things those papers have said themselves still need to be done. And if you really feel like, maybe it's a little bit too saturated, it would never hurt to reach out to those authors themselves and see if maybe you can work together, or if they might have an idea and they needed a student to come on and help them out. And, usually speaking to the expert or to the authors of that paper will be a really great way for you to get involved in that field and understand it and learn about it a little bit more. So that'd probably be my biggest advice.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Our next question focuses a little bit more on being a woman in STEM. So as a woman in STEM, what would your message be to all of the women out there who are thinking of pursuing a career in STEM, but maybe are a little bit hesitant to do so?
Yeah, that's so important. What a big question, a little bit tough to answer. I think if I reflect on my own experiences, and the thing that helped me the most was just really owning it and really feeling like you deserve to be there. Like any room that you walk into, you absolutely are meant to be there. You deserve to be there. And you have a unique perspective based on your lived experiences and the barriers that you've had to surpass and your personal identity. All those things intersect to give you a really unique experience at that table that, there's no chance that anyone else at that table is going to have. So just knowing that it's always good to prioritize yourself and your voice. And, when I was at Hopkins, especially, I always felt imposter syndrome of, oh, everyone here is so smart. It's cool that I'm here. I'm lucky that I'm here, but I'm lucky and they deserve it. But that's not really how it works. If you're in that room, again, you're meant to be there. You deserve to be there. Your skills have brought you there. Your experiences have brought you there. And you almost have to make sure you don't do a disservice to yourself and let that opportunity slide by without giving them the privilege of hearing about what you have to say and what you think about that topic or whatever it might be. And a quick tip that I have to overcome that imposter syndrome or maybe that initial fear is writing out a quick list of all your strengths and all the things that you're really proud of that you've accomplished. And they don't have to be academic, they could be personal things. Just highlighting different skills that you have, that you've worked for and that you've tried to refine and that you're really proud of. And so in those moments where, I had a big presentation or I had to do my thesis defense, I would quickly go in the background, read my list, remind myself who I am, why I'm here, and then go on to that stage and do that. And in doing that, you're going to inspire so many other people because they see someone that maybe they didn't see in their development or in their growth. And they're like, wow, she could do it. Why could I not do it? So that would probably be my biggest thing is just let yourself be your own biggest fan, really.
That's amazing. And I think that can be difficult, like you mentioned, for a lot of people to do. And it really is inspiring to see, a fellow female up here saying that. So thank you. Our next question comes from Taylor. And she says, if you were to do something differently in your science career, what would you have done differently if you could change something?
That's a good question. I think I probably would have taken my own advice in this presentation a little bit sooner. I think I would have told myself to relax, especially earlier on, because I really felt like I had to have it all figured out. And it almost got to the point where I was like, at least before I got involved with the bipolar disorder research, I was kind of like, I'll take whatever research comes to me or take whatever comes. And it really should be about pursuing what you care about and not panicking because you see people around you. And, like I saw people that were doing science fair from way earlier on in elementary school. Meanwhile, I did it in grade 12. So I was always like, oh God, like, have I fallen behind or have I not done enough? And really it just comes down to finding the thing that you care about and then pursuing that regardless of the timeline that comes with it, because there's no correct timeline really. There's periods where maybe you'll progress on paper faster, and then periods where it's slower. And it's really just a big wave when it comes to progress and what you're doing. So I think my biggest advice would have just been to really pursue the thing that I care about. If that changes over time, which as you saw in our presentation, it changed a bunch of different times and I ended up in public health and now medicine, that's okay. But don't compare yourself so much to the people around you and really just trust in your own timeline.
It's definitely an amazing piece of advice. Thank you so much. Switching gears a little bit here, we have a few questions that relate to the ambassador program. So what was one of your favorite parts of being an ambassador? We also have a question asking about how you became an ambassador and what that process looks like. And then also the skills that you gained as an ambassador, how they helped your STEM career. So talk about your ambassador experience.
Just all of it. Okay.
Yes.
The ambassador experience is probably one of the coolest things I've ever done in my life. So I highly encourage you all to think about it, consider it when you're out of high school. Okay. Biggest takeaway. I think the people that you meet, honestly, being part of science fair in the background versus doing it as a finalist is such a different experience. They're both equally as fun, but it's such a different experience because you get to wear that purple shirt. You're part of Team UV. You know, when people are just starting on their science fair journey, or maybe it's another grade 12 students who just got in and is really excited to experience it and is probably going to have a life-changing week. You're the first face that they see, or at least when I was at Fredericton, we were cheering them on, the different arrivals in the airport. And that was such a cool experience because you get to give back and you get to facilitate what is going to be a really formative week for so many different students, and you meet students from all walks of life, which is great, all different ages. And you get to connect with so many different people and learn about so many different projects. So that's really great. And even with the ambassador team themselves, I actually hung out with them a few weeks ago recently for my birthday. You stay so close because you're all very like-minded, but all doing very different things. And so the people that you meet are just people that really, they just stay with you the rest of your life, which is awesome. Going into how I became an ambassador. So this is something I didn't mention, but that has its own timeline as well, because I actually applied a few times to be an ambassador. And I think the first 2 times I tried, it didn't work out. And I remember the third time I was looking at the link and I was like, oh, should I do it again? Like, am I really ready for another disappointment? But the third time is actually the time that it worked out. And when I got to go to Fredericton, and then I was able to do it for a few years afterwards, before school got a bit busy. So in terms of how to apply, I think if you genuinely really care about science fair and you had a really positive experience, send in an application when it's broadcasted on Youth Science Canada and convey that in your interview. Show how much of an impact it had, why you want to be able to facilitate that for other students, and just highlight the type of different things that you might want to learn or might want to contribute. So you're a mentor, you're also just a support, you're the automatic friend for people who might arrive and they don't know many people there. You're the person that is there and is going to be super approachable and is able to support them. If no one's going up to their poster, you're the person that goes and really makes sure that everyone feels really valued. And I think that's just the coolest part. So 10 out of 10, I would recommend it.
I definitely agree with that. Definitely agree. I've loved my experience this week as an ambassador. And like you said, I definitely encourage anyone who loves CWSF to apply once they have the chance. Now, our next question focuses a little bit more on your current endeavors in school. So what is a piece of advice that you would give to someone who's pursuing a career in medicine and wants to go to medical school?
Yeah, also a really good question. Gosh, this could be a whole presentation on its own, because the medical school journey is a tough one. Depending on who you speak to, some people are able to do it the first try, some people do it twice, 3 times, 4 times. It is a bit of an arduous journey. And if it's something that you really want, you just go into it really prepared. My biggest piece of advice would be to speak to as many different types of students from different schools, upper years, lower years, and just really understand what the program is going to look like and what a career in medicine might be like. Because sometimes we enter it with some some misconceptions about what it might be and what it might look like. And then we enter and we're like, oh gosh, this is, so unexpected. So I think really making sure you're asking people questions like, what does your best day look like? What does your worst day look like? So that when you go into the application process, you're really ready to push and put in all the energy that you're going to have to put in. And then when you enter, you're just happy to be there, because yes, it is challenging. But now that I'm here now, I really can't imagine myself doing anything else, even though it is certainly challenging. But I think with medical school applications, the same thing that I said with ambassador applications, you really want to make sure that the things that are shining through are the things that you're really, really passionate about, because it's really easy to kind of copy paste what other people have done and to think, I have to take those steps because it worked for them, therefore it's going to work for me. My application looked extremely different than a lot of the people in my program now. I did grad school first. I had some time to learn about the social aspects of health. And now I entered medicine, understanding a little bit more about how does your context affect your health, and why might we be seeing the same type of person entering the ER, or different communities that are really affected by certain illnesses much more than other communities. So that was something that was really valuable to me. There are people in my program now who are engineers, or who came from business, or who came from law or arts, or there's a musician actually in our program who is now in medical school. So I think I just say there isn't one correct path, but you have to do the things that you really care about, regardless of what that is. And that's going to be the thing that makes you interesting, and that makes people want to learn more about your story. So I think the commonality in all of this is just pursue the things that you actually really care about and are really passionate about, and don't do anything just because you think you have to, or you think you need to check that box on your CV.
I think that's really great advice. I think a lot of people, think they need those opportunities, and it's great to hear from you that, doing what you're passionate about is what you should be doing. That's really great. Our next question comes from Jerome. He asks, who are your biggest influences and your role models in your life?
Oh, wow. Okay, let's get sentimental. I think biggest influences and role models. I think honestly for myself, I have role models in different things. Like I always looked up to different people for different things. The women in my family, my mom and my grandma, they immigrated here from the Middle East. And so they conveyed a certain type of strength that I really try to channel into in moments of difficulty. And that's the things that propel myself further, because the things that they were able to do while, on a CV, it might not look like research or things like that. They still gained a lot of different skills and resilient. And Mobdi was mentioning grit, but were able to teach me those things through life skills and life lessons. So that was hugely important. Another thing or another person or people have been really just all the women that I've encountered in this whole experience, whether it was, the two women who brought me into the world of research and really took a chance on me, who was, I think I was 15 or 16 at the time. They allowed me to be in their lab, and they continued to mentor me when I went to Queen's, and still wrote my reference letters to allow me to get into grad school. And so at each step, I had so many people helping me and really cheering me on and rooting me on. And so, all of us, if we're here now, we really didn't do it alone. Even though you might have done a lot of the work, and you should absolutely credit yourself for it, we all had people helping us, which is why it's so important that when we get to a place where we're the ones with a network and we're the one in positions that are, I guess, more senior, that we're really open to sharing those things and responding to emails from different youth that come up to us. And I really try to do that now with anyone that reaches out to me. So I guess short answer would be Dr. Andrietza and Dr. Kim, who really just brought me into STEM and elevated me as much as they could. And then the people in my family as well. But long answer is everyone.
That's incredible. Kind of branching off from that, why do you think representation really matters in STEM? I think you've touched on a few notes here, but if you wanted to elaborate on it, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think representation is so important. My thesis and all my work in grad school was all about equity and health equity, and making sure that we really understand whose voices are in the room, and then why certain people aren't at the table and why those people are being left out. We always use the words like marginalized, I use intentionally excluded, because sometimes we don't really realize the different barriers, because barriers in the way of a certain goal or of a certain outcome, because we didn't have to face those necessarily ourselves. And I think that's why, like, genuine representation, inclusion, equity, anti-racism, those concepts are so important, because we get to hear and learn from people that are different than ourselves, and from people who, you know, maybe live next door but have had vastly different experiences in that neighborhood because of who they are and because of how they're, you know, what their intersectional identity is. So I think it's hard to answer this as in a short answer, but you need representation because everyone is different, and different communities face different barriers in life in their day-to-day. You know, the people that are in our programs, for example, we think about what did they have to do and what are some barriers that I didn't ever necessarily have to face because of certain privileges that I have. And then how can I use my position now to make sure that those communities are still elevated and they can still achieve the same goals? So it's really important to think about really sometimes scary but important concepts like privilege and oppression and racism, and understand how that works in the world around us, because we all are seeing it in some way, and then understand our space in either being an ally or helping support communities that maybe are sometimes excluded. So yeah.
Absolutely. That was a great answer. Thank you so much. I think we'll have our last question for the day here. And Annika wants to know, what do you tell yourself on days when you feel kind of stuck or maybe you're a bit down on yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think everyone should have their own little toolkit, their own little like self-help toolkit of, I'm feeling down. These are the things that I need to do to kind of bring myself back up. So let me think. Recently, we had a neurology exam. It was a very tough exam. And so I know that the things that I need to do for myself are to go outside, to have some sort of physical activity, and then to come back in and set a plan to not make the mistake that I made that time. So with an exam, for example, how can I be better prepared for the next one? Or if I'm feeling really burnt out, or I can detect the signs within myself of, oh, you're about to become really tired, you're about to, you know, crash with your energy levels because of how busy of a week or 2 weeks you've had, I make sure to really schedule time off for myself. So I will physically block off my schedule if I'm able to, and if I'm not in the hospital, and I will use that time or that weekend really just for myself and to replenish my energy levels and to feel good again. Because you can really, really love what you're doing, but if you're tired and you feel like you're overworked, it's not going to be fun anymore. And that's, you know, really disappointing when the thing that you love doesn't become fun anymore. So taking care of yourself, regardless of what field you're in or what you're pursuing, I think is really the most important thing. So I'd urge you all to just make your own little kit or mental kit or Word document, whatever it might be, of how you can make yourself feel better, whether it's baking or, you know, playing on a sports team, or in high school I did spoken word poetry, and that made me feel really good. Have that kit and then rely on that when you do see that you're getting tired or you're disappointed about something or you're a little bit down, and it should help you.
That's great advice. Thank you so much, Nika. And that wraps up today's session. So thank you so much to all of our speakers today. Next up, we do have Ambassador Sage's Body Break session happening in just a minute at 4:30 Eastern Time. So click on that specific session in the agenda to watch. Thank you so much, everyone.